we don't leave our men or women in uniform behind. And that dates back to the earliest days of our revolution. We have consulted with Congress for quite some time about the possibility that we might need to execute a prisoner exchange in order to recover Sergeant Bergdahl.
5 Taliban commanders held in American custody were swapped for Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl. The Obama administration cozied up to Bergdahl's parents even while there was plenty of consternation over the truth about their son. Now the military courts may be finally ready to act, and it could be an explosive embarrassment for the president, especially when some backroom deals may be coming to final light. Always a pleasure to welcome back to MidPoint Senior Fellow at the London Center for Policy Research and retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer joins us. Lieutenant Colonel, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Ed. Thanks for having me.
Tony, I guess where we're at this point is so many Americans are going to be asking a simple question. What took so long?
Well, you addressed it in the narrative. I think the fact that the investigation was completed last year, I believe in October, it's taken all this time because there is a certain level of bureaucracy that this has to go through and be validated, no doubt. But the real story here, Ed, is the White House's work behind the scenes, and I've been told this by several senior officials, to essentially make this go away. And really, there's no way for it to go away. To put it bluntly, Sergeant Bergdahl deserted his post, and the investigations now have factually shown that. So with that in mind, there has to be an accounting for Bergdahl's actions, and that accounting essentially is something that is well documented. There's a uniform code of military justice that has to be followed, essentially, since this was a uniform member of the military. And that's what is, I think, both concerning, that the White House interfered with this, and secondly, that they've tied this to a larger national security debate, which, frankly, as you mentioned, the 5 Taliban being returned as the price of returning Sergeant Bergdahl is something a lot of folks are going to have to question for a long time.
With regard then to Sergeant Bergdahl's release, with regard to the swap, or should I say, has the president and this administration put national security at a risk that will take years to salvage and Band-Aid?
The answer is absolutely. And let me answer that in 2 parts. First, President Obama had at least 2 to 3 other viable options to getting Bergdahl back. I know this from direct knowledge. This is not someone telling me that. I am aware of these options directly. I can't go into them because some of them are still classified. With that said, the president chose the option he did for 2 reasons. First, it allowed him to get rid of 5 detainees from Guantanamo. That is part of what this White House is trying to do, no matter what, even if that means trading people away who are dangerous. Secondly, the Bergdahl issue as it is, I think he saw this, the president is, as a good news story, something that he could use the military as a prop to show that he's being progressive and supportive of military issues. So I think those 2 things together resulted in the president making some very uninformed decisions, and I think the result of which is catastrophic to our national security, both from the perspective that we do negotiate with terrorists, if someone gets a captive, and secondly, we actually allow these people to go back onto the battlefield at a time we're actually still fighting them. It's just not a good precedent to have set.
Tony, get back to that now about dealing with other governments here in about a minute or so that we have left before we take a break. Is there any doubt that since the Bergdahl swap happened, at least in your mind and the people that you speak to, that the United States is at this moment engaged with other governments, other people that we normally would not deal with, to create some sort of goodwill, if you might want to put it that way, to create other swaps, but in other words, to basically cave to what the terrorists want at all times and go against the fact that we said we'd never negotiate with terrorists, but we're doing it every day?
Ed, at least in the case of the Guantanamo prisoners, they want to have good relations so they can dump people away from Guantanamo. That's the simple truth. From what I'm hearing from my sources is that the president wants Guantanamo shut, period. And they're going to do whatever it takes, even to get rid of those most guilty, I believe, or potentially guilty of crimes against the United States during the 9/11 planning and execution. So to me, there's no doubt that there's something very wrong here, especially when you start using a political narrative to manage national security issues. It's simply not the right thing to do, and I think it will cause grave damage for the long term.
And of course, we're going to talk about Gitmo here in a couple of minutes as well, because there's also that discussion about more prisoners at Gitmo, who they are, what the reality of those are. Lieutenant Colonel, hang on just a moment, other side of the break. Reality on the ground also in Kobane. The impossibility of thinking real cooperation with the new Yemen government. And we are back to the good old days of international spying, when Russians and Americans used to all wander around their various little places of interest, and they would look, and they would sneak, and they would find. America's caught a few. Let's talk about that and so much more. We question everything. MidPoint continues. All right, break out the old trench coat, find the exploding gas pen, see if someone still has a poison blade in the tip of their boot. Maybe Tony does. We're back to good old-fashioned spying again. That's where we begin with retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, Senior Fellow at the London Center for Policy Research, Tony Shaffer. Tony, here we have a Russian spy ring operating in New York City to collect economic intelligence broken up by the FBI. Right. They have one individual in custody. Some more, I guess, they're looking at. We don't hear much about spying anymore right now. Everything has changed in the last couple of decades. Is there still a healthy spying going on between the United States and Russia?
Oh, more than ever. I think just because the Cold War has ended, there was another spy ring captured about, as I recall, about 5 years ago, where that ring was focused right here in Washington, collecting essentially policy information and information about those making the policy. It was not after anything classified. It was simply after atmospherics and individuals who were actually involved in this. So the bottom line is, I think it's more important than ever to understand that this goes on. It goes on at all levels. And it's not simply about military or classified information. It's about information which is protected. Any information that's protected usually has a value, and that information of value is what these spies are after.
Would it be fair to say that they are more than likely going after economic data at this point because of where they're at, and maybe the larger military intelligence data is being left to others in other places?
I think the information that they're after, at least if they're based in New York, is absolutely economic. It has to do with trends, has to do with companies, and essentially it would be the same information that inside traders would want to have to make good economic decisions. So this, again, the Russians are, as a country, very much a commercial enterprise, especially with Putin in charge. So to have good information to make commercial decisions is necessary. And I think you will see, if the FBI continues to unravel this even more, how deep these guys were. And the military stuff is still important, don't get me wrong, but so much of the military stuff has been sidelined to these larger economic issues, which really have to do with billions of dollars of transactions, which really do affect the ability of a country like Russia to survive and thrive.
All right, let's get back to good old-fashioned terrorism. The Kurd militia says ISIS is out of Kobane. You buying it that they are entirely out?
No, not. I think they've, for the most part, have pushed them out. No thanks to us, except for the airstrikes. And I think that as long as the Kurds are able to sustain that area, I think they will. Let's remember, the Turks have still not weighed in. That Kobane is a border town. As far as I know, the Turks have never closed the back door for ISIS to continue to allow people who are recruited to come through. And so I think it's a good news story, but it's not nearly as big as, say, Omaha Beach on D-Day. I think this is something that we're going to have to see a lot more of. The next real issue is going to be Mosul. And the Mosul Dam in that area, where I think the Kurds are going to have a whale of a time trying to get ISIS out of that area. But that's where I think the next focus should be.
Tony, is this really worth it? It took more than 700 airstrikes basically to free a town that has a pre-war population of about 45,000 people. It would seem to be insignificant in so many ways.
Well, it had to do both with psychology as well as geography. First, if ISIS had been able to take that town, they would have unimpeded access, essentially from Syria all the way to Baghdad, which is psychologically a blow. Secondly, I think this is where the Kurds recognized that they needed to show their resolve to pushing them back, and they did. So this is a good news story from the fact that ISIS does not have unencumbered access, at least yet, and Kurds showed their mettle once again to show that they are good fighters and can do the job. I think this should encourage us to even do more with them as we continue to prosecute and try to recruit boots on the ground to go against ISIS.
Here's a late report coming in right now from NBC News that ISIS has made a demand that a failed female suicide bomber be released. Her explosive failed to detonate during a 2005 attack in Jordan at a hotel. She's the sister of a top commander under the former leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Is this all about propaganda? Because some people say suddenly we have ISIS being able to show people that they really do care about females more than what anybody else might think. This just smacks of really nothing more than propaganda to me.
It is all propaganda, and I think that's why, as was stipulated by the White House Chief of Staff over the weekend, he blurted out the fact that there's a female U.S. prisoner held by ISIS. I think ISIS is very cognizant of what the consequences would be to start beheading females and going down that path. So I think they are trying to show a softer side. They've actually put out documents on how to be a good wife, how to go about raising children for the jihad. So I think in many ways this is but one more aspect of their propaganda work, both as a recruiting tool as well as trying to show that they're not all completely bad.
You'd have a lot of argument about that. About 30 seconds
Right.
left. The Italian newspaper Il Giornale is posting footage that they claim shows that there is proof of U.S. military assistance to the government of Kiev. The video actually shows maybe one American soldier in the Ukraine. Do your sources tell you anything about Americans in any sort of amount being on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, there's not any great amount, but clearly there's advisors. I mean, I think that's one of the things that people should recognize. Even the State Department has kind of alluded to this, that the United States is kind of siding with the current Ukrainian government and trying to help them. Most of the assistance so far is supposed to be material relating to humanitarian issues, food, medical, things like that. But clearly the Russians are stepping up their ability and interest in arming their side. So inevitably, I think you're going to have to figure out how far are you willing to go to support Ukraine? And will that include either NATO or U.S. forces or advisors to do that? I think we're on the path of seeing that happen.
The word is inevitable indeed. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us, and MidPoint will continue.